Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to our live streams, Ask Us Anythings and Q&As. Hope you guys are all having a great day so far. We're going to get into some topics today before we get to your guys' questions, beginning with our official final full review of Star Wars Outlaws. We're going to talk about the gameplay and we'll talk a little bit about the story while trying to keep it, I guess, semi-spoiler free. And if you guys haven't played the game and we do want to talk about spoilers, we'll preface that before we start. And then we're also going to talk about Lego Star Wars Rebuild the Galaxy, which is kind of a movie, kind of a show. It's 4 episodes, but it's only an hour and 10 minutes long, so hour and 20 minutes long. So it's pretty short. So you can definitely check that out. We will definitely not go into spoilers on that because it just came out. So you guys will probably still, a lot of you still haven't checked it out. So we're going to review both of those things. We're going to talk about a little bit in the world of Star Wars news. There's not too much here in the world of Star Wars news. A couple of topics we're going to bring up mainly is the biggest news is that the third Jedi game from Respawn is going to be Cal Kestis's final Jedi game, or at least as the main character, it seems. He probably will show up unless he dies, and we're all hoping he shows up one day in live action, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. There's also some smaller news stories, like some things Donald Glover has said about Lando, and then, of course, Ewan McGregor last week getting his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. So we're going to get to all of that. Before we do so, make sure you hit that like button. We always appreciate the likes. Right now, we have more people watching than have liked the video. So make sure you hit that like button. It helps us get out to more Star Wars fans so we can have more people in this community to discuss all things Star Wars. Comment below in the chat and let us know all the things you've been thinking about with Star Wars. It can be about the topics we're going to discuss today. It could be about anything related to Star Wars or otherwise. We've had some fun conversations the past few weeks about horror movies and different film franchises and all that type of stuff. So it can be anything you would like to discuss. Send it into the chat. We will get to it. It will be first come, first serve, though. So if you want to, make sure you get a chat on. If the chat is full and you're getting buried under all of these chats, you're welcome to send in a super chat. It helps out the channel and it will bump your chat up to the top. We will instantly answer your chat first. So, other than that, no rules for sending in the chat, just first come, first serve. So, keep sending those in and then we will get to them as soon as we can. But we're going to start off with the two main topics as people continue to trickle in to the chat room. And the first one is going to be Star Wars Outlaws. So, Star Wars Outlaws, we've talked about it a lot over the last couple weeks. It has kind of trickled out with its excitement. People didn't necessarily buy this in bulk upon release, and we talked about that last week. Ubisoft being disappointed with the numbers of game sales. They also do have their streaming service and Ubisoft stock dropping, and then you have seen those people out there kind of hating on this game. Other people are saying, oh no, it's not that bad, it's so much better than you think. Definitely check it out. We're going to give you guys our full thoughts here, having both finished the game and put quite a few hours into this. Sanak, I'm going to pass it to you first. What are your thoughts overall on the quality of Outlaws as a video game? And then we'll talk about the story here after.
Yeah, as a video game, I wouldn't say I'm like impressed by it in the same way that Jedi Survivor was. This feels pretty similar to how Fallen Order was, where it's like, okay, you've kind of built out this Souls light level gameplay for Star Wars now, and it makes perfect sense for a Jedi, especially a Jedi during the dark times where you're gonna have to be a little bit more relentless, a little bit more lethal about what you're doing, right? So there was a good formula for that game, even if it was mostly carried by the story, I would say, which, again, like we've talked about before, it's not a story that necessarily is groundbreaking, but it has a lot of more in-depth enrichment of what Order 66 was like, especially for Padawans, which has become like a really big focus recently in Disney Star Wars. So that was a game that, yes, the gameplay was established, story was really kind of dragging it upward, right, to becoming like a really underrated, if not really beloved game of the Disney canon. But then once you start coming into Survivor, that's a game that's like it maximizes everything. Even if there were performance issues at launch and all that, the story is still pretty on par with the first one in a lot of ways, but the gameplay is just fabulous. So In that same way, I do feel like this game is really Ubisoft's, like, kinda their Fallen Order. The gameplay is, for the most part, set there. I wasn't expecting anything crazy, this being a scoundrel-led game, you know, you don't have any force abilities and all that. I was just looking forward to being in the culture of being a scoundrel or bounty hunter, just someone who's a criminal in the underworld, and I think this gameplay really does enmesh you into that. It's definitely not something for the first couple hours that you can go that full send, like, scoundrel gunslinger kind of build that you'd get in something like Star Wars: The Old Republic from day one, because that's, like, the class that you're aiming for. This is not like that. This is, like, a very story-driven scoundrel, and Kay Vess is very naive in a lot of ways, even though she does have certain skills that she's just not realizing why she learned them and what was the purpose until you start seeing flashbacks to her earlier life and all that. But it does become pretty immersive. I'd say it is just a little weak about some things like takedowns. I think work great when someone isn't armored. Like I totally understand how you'd use Nyx to distract or attack, or even go for that combo when you're hitting someone. But it does start to feel like a little bit of like an Obi-Wan Kenobi situation with Indira Varma's character, where she starts like clobbering the troopers on the head. And you know, even if they are plastic bucket heads, it's still gonna hurt a little bit. Like, it's not like you're even going for a pressure point hit or something that, you know, I'd be like, "Oh, you're, like, aiming for the gaps in between the armor plates or something." So, that's where, like, I wish this game had spent, like, a little bit more time, because otherwise I felt like it's pretty solid. The gun mechanics are very arcadey, nothing, like, crazy to scream about, but there is a decent level of customability, which I think really does open up the gameplay a little bit. But it does take a little while for that to get going, and then it does plateau pretty quickly. Space combat, you know, it's fine. It's nothing special. It feels very much like the Battlefront 2 space gameplay. Just it's there. I would have preferred something more like the Old Republic fighter squadron gameplay, if they really had the time to go for something like squadrons, especially because we haven't really had a chance to take, like, a freighter, like a Millennium Falcon, like the Trailblazer in this Trailblazer in this game to, like, really, like, elevate it and see, like, what is the difference in flying this with your cargo, with your weight against TIE fighters, against smaller ships, against larger ships. So I mean, that is the ultimate issue with this game, is that it plateaus in its gameplay pretty quickly, and then some of the choices it makes, to kinda be standardized across do limit it from, like, reaching certain greatness. But I think the worlds are really well realized. I think the only thing that I was a little disappointed by was Kijimi, and that's just because I thought this was a great opportunity to expand past the city. Like, this is the only place you really can't use your speeder, and everywhere else, once you aren't in the non-restricted areas, you can explore and really make use of the environment and everything, and there's so much with, like, the Shiga clan and everything that I felt like they're hinting at, like, this is such a really interesting, strange planet instead of just, like, a frozen tundra like The Rise of Skywalker kinda posits, so stuff like that was annoying, a little disappointing. But it's hard to say, like, I had too many issues with this game. It is super immersive, it is great, even if the quests are not, like, challenging or super rewarding, and it feels like Fallen Order and Survivor in that same where it's like, "Oh, I'm getting a new haircut," or "I'm getting a new poncho," or something, right? Even if it is that equivalent here, I still do feel like the locations that you get to go to, the people that you kinda run to, like the real-time events of speeder races and helping out villagers being attacked and all that, that's fun. That's, like, something that I feel like the open world elements really did deliver on. I felt like I was constantly someone that it wasn't like I had to be on the main quest, but even if I was focused on that, I would kind of be pulled aside for something like that. And the mini games I think are really a highlight. The Father races, uh, Sabak for sure. You know, just the little arcade games, especially those ones with great sound design and like very retro futuristic graphics. Really appreciated all that. But yeah, no, it's a good game. It's a very solid 7 out of 10. This is kind of what we were talking about this whole time leading up to this. You can see through the let's plays and the walkthroughs that we've been putting up on the channel. It's just fun to run around the world, but sometimes if you're not that interested in the main quest, yeah, you're like, okay, well, I'm just like kind of standing around, or I'm just kind of doing things and just customizing myself as best as I can. But I think this is a good start. I think this is a game that I would love to see like a sequel set in the early New Republic era. That's something that just hasn't been established. And maybe with the Battle Jakku comics kind of cleaning up that first year, maybe that gap between end of Battle Jakku to the start of the Mandoverse, maybe that's now opened up for a character like K-Vest to, you know, build off of like the interludes in those aftermath novels and really become more of a character instead of just this innocent kind of fighter that we start to grow into with this game.
Yeah, I have a similar take about the game overall as you, but I think I had a little lesser experience just in general. Big fan of open world games, and I felt like a lot of the hallmarks of open world games were missing here. Like this is as bland as possible for open world games. Uh, the and that really hinges on the fact that there is very little replayability in my opinion. There's not too much to do, and a lot of it is the same old repetitive stuff over and over and over again. I think a lot of that hinges on the fact that there's not too much customization. I think there are cosmetic customizations and very minor buffs, but ultimately there's no real leveling system in this game for your ship. At least they could have done a leveling system. I
Yeah.
understand it kind of doesn't make much sense to give a scoundrel some type of leveling power, but in some way you do need to be able to work towards something. There needs to be a reason to do the side stuff outside of money, which is very easy to come by if you're just looting things, right? So
Yeah.
either make the money more difficult to obtain or make money an essential piece to advancing to the next part of the game. And for me, when I found myself doing side missions, it was purely just because I'm right next to something that I could do. Might as well. I'm right here. I didn't often go back and have a desire to go explore. And I think that's the biggest miss for Outlaws is it's something that just feels shallow in its exploration. And an open world game really should feel awesome to explore, and especially a game that does as well as Outlaws does at creating the worlds. Because, like you said, this is a very immersive game, if not the most immersive Star Wars game ever. It has the environments, they look movie accurate, everything looks really nice. There's a lot of aliens and just civilians walking around talking. You can stand there and listen to people talk, people will walk by you. Things that were missing in something like Jedi Survivor, for as great as the gameplay and the story are in that game, you have an empty Coruscant with no people walking around besides people to fight. So there's an element of detail here that seems like most of the production value of this game went into that and less of it went into the game. They were like, let's create Star Wars. And then once they started building it, they're like, uh-oh, we still don't have any ideas for how to make this game because that's kind of where we're at. I did have quite a few technical problems. I was hearing some people were having some at the beginning, but ultimately leveled out. And I would say once I got through to Shara, I had a lot less. So it might have just been that first week, but I did have some technical problems. I had one time where I was in a firefight and I rolled the dodge, rolled inside of a rock, and I couldn't get out. It was a game breaking bug. I had to restart the game, which was like 20 minutes earlier, my last save point, and redo that entire area when I was about to finish it. I also had two crashes on PS5, and there are some wonky animations. The takedowns, like you were saying, I think they look incredibly goofy. They could have given Kay some type of stun baton or maybe to some type of like brass knuckles, something, anything to make it a little more realistic that this small woman is punching a stormtrooper in the head and they're immediately getting knocked out with one punch, or done something with Nyx, something where it just looks a little more realistic. But that aside, a lot of the times when I was doing takedowns, the sound was off, or you have a stormtrooper say like, "Hey," and then that hadn't even turned around yet, and then you're punching them, and then you don't hear the sound where it should be. So I had a lot of sound problems with that. I also had one time where I could not get Nix to get in an elevator with me, and it wouldn't go down without him. And that I think got patched out because eventually, when he wouldn't get into elevators, he would just teleport behind me. So there were quite a few technical problems I had with the game. I also just had other problems with the open world concept. And I think this game has a lot to do if you're willing to be repetitive, but ultimately, a lot of them just are very, very simple. There's no specific structural reason to do anything on the side other than just, hey, I want to get the platinum, or hey, I want to upgrade my stuff all the way. I think a lot of that is in weapon diversity and combat diversity. There's very little here. I think the nice thing about upgrading your weapon to three different modes is it's cool, but really it's only for story purposes. If you were in combat, you could just use the base blaster and get through the whole thing completely fine with a couple of upgrades. I think that's kind of disappointing because there's not too much upscaling in the leveling in this game. There's a lot of like basic tier enemies that you fight the entire game, and they don't really get much harder. A few of them get to be kind of bullet sponges at the end, but ultimately there's your heavies, there's the guy with the shields, and then there's your basic troopers, which with a standard blaster you can shoot and take down in like 3 shots. Anyways, so I don't know. I didn't find the combat too varied. I think one of the things people have been making fun of with this game, and I agree with it in some capacity, is the whole idea of picking up weapons off the ground, but then you drop them immediately whenever you do anything. So you take somebody down silently, you drop the weapon. You climb a ladder, you drop a weapon. You try to jump, you drop a weapon. None of why even have those weapons to pick up just to use for a couple seconds? They also all run out of ammo extremely fast. So I just think some type of capacity would have made this game a little bit better and more varied on a combat level. You have your basic blaster, and let's say you have that the entire time, but picking up two weapons, maybe you can have two weapon slots and you hold those weapons for the entire game. You can find more ammo for them or you can use them. I'm not with people who think it's ridiculous they run out of ammo. That's obviously a game mechanic that's part of this game, but it is a little weird when your blaster doesn't and then all the other guns do. So there are just basic things like that that it seems like they weren't extremely well thought out. And I think that causes the loop to just lose steam about halfway in. I spent about 27 hours so far through this game doing as much side stuff as I could. And I think I'm pretty much done. I might play a few more hours of it, but ultimately, it's a game that I started to push through to finish the story, and I didn't really have that much interest once it was over. I was bummed because I was enjoying the end of the story, but by the time it got to the very end, I was like, I think I can take a break for now. And then 2, 3, 4 days went by, and I never touched it again. And I think I've played it once since last week when I finished the story. So ultimately, I think it's an okay game. I hope for more. Like you said, I want a second game though, because I think the bones are here. If they take this exact same game, the way it looks, the way it's designed, and ultimately improve all of the gameplay mechanics, I think you can have a really excellent open world Star Wars game. Like, I think it can bump up from what I'm going to give it, which is about a 6.5 out of 10, to maybe an 8, 8.5 if you just improve the gameplay. But ultimately, I think it's the gameplay that holds it back. And yeah, I think it's kind of right where I'm at though. So I don't feel that disappointing. I don't feel that disappointed because I always thought this was going to be somewhere between a 6.5 and a 7.5. And it hit right there in that middle. It was a little higher for me at the beginning when I started playing. I think it was closer to the 7, 7.5. By the end, just the fact that I wasn't that interested in playing the actual game part and more so just seeing what happens in the story, it dropped for me a bit. One other thing I do want to mention too that I could not stand, and this really irritated me a lot, was when you get contracts and you go into an area, not really intending to do a contract, and then you leave that area, but the AI triggers that you were working on a contract, it immediately fails and you can't go back and redo it. It's done. It's over. You can't do that one. And at first I was really upset because I was like, oh man, I'm failing missions that now I'm going to have to restart the entire game to play. But then ultimately I realized that contracts don't really matter unless you're trying to get up your reputation in factions, which is a cool element of the game as well, but I think also needed more depth and more consequence. So anyway, that was my long-winded review, but I enjoyed my experience with this. I think it's definitely worth picking up for half price or less if you guys are interested in checking out Outlaws and you haven't. It is better than you think it will be, but it is a pretty bland basic experience. I don't think worth $70. So now let's talk a little bit about the story mode. And let us know in the chat, guys. Have you played Outlaws? Do you care about spoilers? Do you want no spoilers? We can talk a bit about story, both vaguely and in spoilers. So let us know in the chat. We can answer a couple chats while we're waiting to hear people's response to that. Scrolling back through here, were there any about Outlaws specifically? Let's see. I don't see really anything about Outlaws in the chat. So if you guys let us know if you want a spoiler review right now of the story. If not, we will do non-spoilers. Ovier says I'm going to play later and don't mind spoiler, but can leave the stream at any time. I don't mind. Well, then we can do kind of a I don't know. We can do a basic story review. Anthony doesn't mind. So what do you think, Sanak? Would you like to talk spoilers about the story, or do you think we can do a basic story review?
Yeah, I think we can talk a little spoilers. It really is kind of just the end and some of the twists around there that really have consequence. Um, I would say just as a story, it is a very, very scoundrel-coded beginning. Like this is how I expect most like stories to go into it. And like the opening title sequence with the logo and the way it lights up and it's a little bit rusted and ragged, it immediately makes everyone think about Solo: A Star Wars Story, and it's honestly very intentional. Like this, everything that could go wrong for Kves goes wrong. That's kind of how her story begins. She keeps on making these amateur rookie mistakes when she's on Kanto, and then that's what gets her this death mark with Zarek Besh, right? The rest of the like beginning of the story, after you spend a lot of time on the first planet, Toshara, right? It does divulge more into like we have to just put together a crew, right? And just like Solo: Star Wars Story kind of does like the inverse of that, right? And then kind of redoes it again in the story. This one just opts for just a bit more of a streamlined version of it. And I will say I did appreciate having like a fully, almost fully alien crew, right? And it did allow for the species that are kind of underserved to get a little bit more fun out of it, right? So it was nice to see that this crew could be like a nice blend of original trilogy aliens who very much populate this game for sure. I love Ack or whatever her name is because she's just insane. I do wish though that while you're like kind of going on to these main story beats, trying to free them outside of the main mission and like kind of hearing the tidbits to get to them to kind of like rescue them. I wish we got like a little bit more about like who these characters are before and their relationship if they have some with Kay, right? Um, that was my one issue with the story because some of these characters have a history with her, and I was like, okay, then if you're gonna hint at it, especially after like you join the crew, why not say a little bit more, like pull that out a little bit more? And I guess they don't really do that. So I can see why for people that beginning feels very solo Star Wars story like, and then once you kind of go on this, I'm putting together crew sort of montage, it does get a little bit boring if you're just relying on the gameplay. So I do agree that is a little bit frustrating. But it is once you get ND5 and his story kind of getting going, that's when it starts getting really back on track. I do like ND5's story. Some of the side quests too on Akiva are like really pertinent to that. And Akiva is just a great planet because of its connections to Aftermath and the fact you get to even meet Snap Wexley here. It's a nice little touch. I know technically Mr. Bones, with where this is placed in the timeline, should already be active, but I do wonder if they're kind of working in the margins here, and you kind of see in his shop that he does have a B1 battle droid. If he's got a Bones that like is his guard, that's kind of helping him around, but then the Mr. Bones with the crazy paint job and everything kind of starts appearing maybe like a year or two later, more closer to when the aftermath books really begin once Battle of Endor completes. But yeah, no, ND5 story is pretty rich. I like how that like dynamic really developed, especially once his battery kind of got drained. And you're like, you need to save him here, right? And it was nice to kind of build into that story. The Zarek Besh twist, obviously, pretty interesting. I wasn't expecting it to be double layered. I thought since the game had been pretty straightforward and story wise, the first twist of like, oh, Sliro's ISB, right? I was like, okay, like yeah, that kind of makes sense. I didn't really necessarily see his brother kind of being the one kind of pulling these strings and then, putting us into the situations where he's trying to put himself in power and he's hunting down his brother for revenge. Like it is very gray and clouded, and I do like that. I do like when these scoundrel stories have those more darker elements where even if they eventually join a rebellion, even if they join a cause, you get to see them before that, and you see like, oh, there are some choices that someone like a Luke Skywalker or a Leia would never really want to make or ever be making, but maybe Han Solo and a Lando like 5 6 years earlier were making pretty consistently. So I thought that was a pretty good choice there. Uh, I I don't I mean, I wish that the story, the way it was kind of posited that it's kind of set during Crimson Reign, I wish there was a little bit more of an obvious like pull for that. I understand Crimson Reign, even in the comics, is more of like a staging ground. It is more about Crimson Dawn gathering power and really pulling strings and forcing all the other syndicates in the Empire to kind of go into this all fronts war, right? And you can see elements of that in this game, but I think the need for the reputation system to then directly tie into the choice of, like, who kinda rescues you, once you have the whole aftermath of the gameplay is it's tough because I think it should have just been Crimson Dawn. I understand if you like Ashiga, if you like the Pikes, which no one likes the Pikes, but but if you're trying to tie it into the story, I think you could have done something where you do have your reputation maxed out with one group, they help you out a little bit, but then you still have Crimson Dawn kind of coming in and cleaning out things and taking advantage of the wreckage that you kind of left behind. I think that would have been more important, and maybe that's like something that could have like fueled and directly led into Hidden Empire, right? So that was something I found just a little lacking about the choice being so dependent on your reputation. But yeah, I do like the also like the tertiary twist of Kay's mom, Rika, being back, right? I was like, oh, okay. I thought that was already coming just because there was so much emphasis on the cutscenes with her. But I do like the tension of that, and that little epilogue scene does really suggest that there is a chance for her and Kay to kind of have a role of some sorts, even if not like a constant supporting character like ND5 and Nyx, but uh, has a role in the DLCs that are coming out. The one with Last Call with Lando, and then the one coming out after that with Hondo. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing if these DLCs will actually further continue and connect to stuff that's happening around Hidden Empire and this little gap in between that is barely left between episode 5 and all the comic stories there, and then the start of episode 6. I wonder just how far the Hondo Naka one will take us. I'm pretty confident we will get a lot of these supporting characters showing up again. In some ways, or like at least some hollow calls or something like Maz Kanata. Just kind of flesh them out. So yeah, I did like the story. It is really just the reasons for putting them together in a crew where I felt like you could have had more richness and depth, and really it was just ND5 that you got it out of. But the last third of the game is pretty engaging. So I was quite happy with the story, other than like the only rescue kind of being done by the reputation that you've really maxed out.
Mhm. Yeah, and I have similar thoughts as well again, but it's a very simple story, but I think it works relatively effectively. I would say character is the biggest problem I had with this, and I think it's just a lack of depth. Again, this is a game that has a relatively short main story campaign. If you're just focusing on that and not doing anything else, you can complete it in like 14 to 15 hours, which is
Yeah.
relatively short for an open world game. It also can go about 20 something hours if you want to. And kind of back to that whole point about not having too much to do on the side of this with the story. I think this story is dramatically missing side quests. There are only a couple that you can do, and most of them all have to do with improving your factions or recruiting different people so that you can get better weapons or get better ship upgrades. There's not too many side missions that have you enhance the characters that are part of the main story. And where Indy 5 is a big crux of this game's emotional hook, I felt like outside of just driving my speeder around and listening to some conversations between the two of them, they hardly ever do anything together, K and Indy 5. You never really do any missions with them. You only do a couple. And so I would have loved some more side stuff where you really get to know these characters that you're going on this dangerous once in a lifetime, maybe never coming back from suicide mission heist. And I didn't really get that. So while I liked having a mostly alien cast in this and droids, I loved how this game really goes into the Star Warsiness of it. Again, going with the aesthetic, right? They could have just chosen all humans. They choose a Rhodian. You know, you have a bunch of different people from all over the galaxy. And I think that adds to the underworld element because the underworld element has always been full of aliens. And I think that's really cool. But I would have loved to have a couple more missions where you continuously learn more about them. And pretty much once you do the main quests, help each one of them accomplish something before they join your team, and kind of that repetitive style. You don't really learn any more about your side characters. And in that same way, Kay is extremely simple. She is basically Han Solo, Lando, all the scoundrels combined, and it works okay. It works fine as a stand-in for those characters. This game, I think, would work obviously a little bit better when you have a character in that same spirit. If you just played as Han Solo or you just played as Lando instead of having a new character, but K has room for improvement. It has room for depth. I just think K could have been given so much more depth if you didn't get a lot of her backstory in small little flashback cutscenes with her mom, and instead actually got to play through some of her past life, or you got to see different things she did in the past with some of these side characters, or you got to go on new adventures where she learns a lesson with a new character. None of that was really there. So pretty much everything about Kay is I'm fighting to stay alive and I'm all out for myself, but then oh, I actually do have some friends and I'm going to make some sacrifices for my friends. And that's a very traditional Star Wars story. It's not necessarily done poorly here, but it is very very simple. And I think that also makes Outlaws not really that memorable because when you finish the the story, a lot of the things that I remember are the trappings around it, not necessarily the characters who drive it. So I found that a little disappointing. But when it comes to the factions and the Imperial side, I did think that was pretty cool. New factions like the Ashiga clan, I thought were really, really cool. I loved seeing the Ashiga clan in full action here, and I thought they have a really impressive looking design and an impressive looking style. And I appreciated doing pretty much all the missions with them. I thought they were very fun to hang out with. And then Zarek Besh, I think, is a pretty cool villain, and all the stuff around them and their connections with the Empire I thought were very interesting for this game. Jalen, as a kind of the guy who sets up this whole heist, I thought he was a little more one note, and I was hoping for a bit more from him. It's kind of the same thing. He only appears if you want to talk to him every once in a while, and sometimes talks to you over comms, but you don't really have any missions where you get to know him. You don't really have any thing with him where you understand anything about him other than when he explains his backstory and the pivotal moments of the story. So I would have liked a little more from him. I was still holding out hope almost the entire game that he was Kyle Katarn, just because I really wanted some type of like interesting, bigger picture twist. But he's not. So for the rest of you guys who haven't played the game, he's not Kyle Katarn. But yeah, ultimately, I thought the story has some good moments. I think it has promise for a future underworld story. I think it's small enough that in a time period that's so dominated by other underworld stories, like you were mentioning, we had War of the Bounty Hunters, Crimson Reign, Hidden Empire, all around the same time. And you also have Return of the Jedi, which has Jabba the Hutt as one of the main parts of the story. This is a time period so dominated by underworld stories that you could have kind of a game that says, screw all that. We're now the best bounty hunter. This is the biggest mission. This is the biggest stakes of all time in Star Wars. And then it really breaks the story and the canon. And they didn't do that. And I'm kind of glad they didn't. in that same way, it suffers because it feels small stakes. But I think if you would have honed in on character a bit more, it doesn't matter how big the stakes are. You would have really, really cared, as some of these characters don't make it out alive from your heists, right? So um, it's a both pros and cons story. I think bigger picture, this game, the story works relatively well. Smaller scale, intimate scale with characters, that's where I think it drops the ball a little bit. But that's our thoughts on Outlaws. Thank you so much for listening to those. And for those of you, if you're checking back in, if you left because you didn't want to hear spoilers, we're done with spoilers about Outlaws. So you can welcome back here and we'll move on to some other topics. And because we've mostly been talking for the first 30 minutes or so of the stream, we'll get into some chats here before we move on to giving you our review of Lego Star Wars Rebuild the Galaxy, which we will keep spoiler free because that just came out. But let's move to the top here. And actually, we do have one question at the bottom from over here about Outlaws. Asks, can you go to Dagobah in the game? No, you can't go to Dagobah, but you can go to, what are the 5 planets? You have Tashara, you have Akiva, you have Kijimi, you have Tatooine. Is that it? Or am I missing one?
I mean, we start off on Kanto, right?
Kanto.
So that
Yeah,
is your starting.
I think that's it. You have some like Imperial stations and some space stations you can go on.
Yeah.
And then there are cities within the planets, so they are relatively big maps. I think some of them could be a little more spread out, some of them could have a little bit more in terms of having different cities or populations, because most of them only have one city, a couple of them have two. But yeah, I think Dagobah would have been a tough one for this style game. I don't know if it really fits into an outlaw
Yeah.
style story, but it'd be cool to
There's nothing
explore.
really. I mean, like, if there is one thing that this does game does as like side quest worthy, it is the expert quest, right? I think one of the ones that everyone's really recommended to me that I've just really gone started on is the veteran, which is like tied to the CIS, and you meet this guy, you have to track him down. Like there is, there's no real equivalent, you know, for reasons to explore some of these other planets if past these experts, right? And if you were saying, oh, Dagobah could be a choice just because it's like a movie planet, I don't think there's really civilization on Dagobah for Kves, and I don't think Kves is the right person to go into the Dagobah cave. So probably not. Though I do think her and Nyx and Yoda would actually hit it off pretty well. Just they'll kind of kooky together.
Yeah, luckily she is not revealed to be force sensitive, so
Yeah.
that's that was a big positive. Usually, if this was Star Wars Legends, she would be force sensitive, and she would be an extremely powerful force user from a big, powerful force family. But that is not the case here. So that's good, at least. Not another Order 66 survivor. Going back to the top here, we have Anthony Tiff, who says, I recently watched Madam Web to see if it really was as bad as people are saying, and they were right. It probably is one of the worst, if not the worst, film I've seen in a long time. I watched a review by Cody Leach, and it was fun watching him destroy the film. Yeah, Cody Leach does some great film reviews, and I always enjoy watching his horror stuff. And he's mostly a horror channel, but this time of year I do enjoy his videos. But yeah, I did see Madam Web. I saw it back in the theaters. Um, you can really blame my girlfriend for that if she's watching, because she loves bad movies. So we went together. That was probably the type of movie that I would have skipped um, before we were together and watched it later. But I'm glad we saw it. I'm glad she pushed me to see it because it is terrible. It's not so bad. It's good though, Anthony. I'm sure you would agree. It is just downright terrible. It is one of the worst movies I've ever seen, and the more and more I think about it, the worse and worse it gets. It is so bad. It is one of those things that you have to see to believe how bad it is. But it is truly abysmal. So I have seen Madam Web, and you're right. It is really, really awful.
You can't say I have, and I have zero intention to. Um, I do find it pretty hilarious that the meme line about like the jungle and my mother was like studying spiders and all that actually not being in the film is like what that was like the one thing you had going, like at least Morbius, the things that you're memeing about and Morbin time and all that was like related to the film and stuff that you could pull straight from the film, but it's kind of strange that this is a film where you have one of the most memeable lines in the trailers, and it's just not in the film. Your lead actress is just like, "I hated working on this film the whole time." She's like, "It's not very good." It's like, "Okay, fine, whatever." And then since it has, like, all these, like, spider family variants, right? I just found it hilarious that they're like, "Oh, yeah, like, we would beat, like, the No Way Home trio Spider-Man," but regardless of power levels and all that, it's the fact that they don't appear in costume until, like, the very end, right?
Yeah,
And they don't, like,
for a
fight.
shot.
They're always on the run in the whole film. It's like, how could you say that? Like, it's such, like, blatantly bad marketing because 'cause you're just like, s okay, the one shots that you have that outside of, like, visions and all that, none of it's real. There's, like, no real fight sequence, which is further frustrating because I don't know, Madam Web from what I remember from, like, the animated series and all that, she is not supposed to be anything like this, so, she's just a strange lady on a chair who just has her own strange Spider-Verse that is even more stranger than the more standard Spider-Verse that you'll believe in and watch, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I this was a film that I had no intention of watching, and I still haven't even watched the Venom ones, but, I think even the new, what is it? Like, if you put Morbius, if you put Madam Web, if you put the Venom films, what's that new one that's coming out? The
Craven.
Craven, right? I would still say, without having seen Craven, that Madam Web's probably the most inaccurate one of all of them.
Oh yeah. Madam Web is just truly abysmal. It has nothing to do with any comic stuff. It's sad they ruined Ezekiel, who's a pretty good villain in the Spider-Man comics, and the actor they chose to play him too. Oh man, it was rough. It was rough. It sounded like they dubbed every line over, to be honest. Almost everything
Yikes.
sounded ADR. So I don't know what they were doing with that. It's an utter disaster, but it's like you have to see it to believe how bad it is. It just truly doesn't. Words don't describe it. It's really, really bad. Um, I keep forgetting it came out this year too, because it came out all the way back in February, I believe. I think it was the Valentine's Day release. So it was a big, big thing for Valentine's Day. Yeah, the way she gets in her wheelchair too, the way she loses her ability to walk is
Yeah.
so absurd. Uh, that movie is so bad. But yeah, don't watch it. It is well, I mean, you can. I'm kinda glad I watched it because I can join in on the conversation about how bad it is, and it's not too long. I have seen Venom 2 and, like, Venom 1 and Venom 2, and I'm not a big fan of Venom. I feel like Venom has its cult following. Some people really like those movies. I really don't. I think Venom 1 is worse than Venom 2 because at least Venom 2 is kind of a self-aware bad cheesy movie. Venom 1 thinks it's being kinda good, and it stinks. But, yeah, let me go. Maybe you guys like Venom, I don't know. I really don't understand the Venom hype. Scrolling through here, we got Ovier says, "Hey guys, won't be here later, so hope you had a good day and was wondering if you guys could guess when Outlaws will go on sale. I'm very cheap and I don't buy full price games." Well, we are having a good day, thank you. Hopefully you're having a good day too. I would say Black Friday. Usually Ubisoft games go on sale right before Christmas. I don't know why, they drop them about half price, but usually the ones that are a little bit older, I think especially since Outlaws isn't selling that well, they probably will drop it quicker than than they were hoping to. Maybe around the other possibility is I'm not sure when the DLC is coming out, but maybe around whenever they release the DLC because they might try to recoup their money by getting people to buy the game cheap since it's not selling and then spend full price on DLC. So we'll see if they do that strategy. But yeah, I think one of those two. But by Black Friday, for sure, I would imagine at least goes down to about $40, if not the full like $35 half price.
Yeah, I don't really know per se. I haven't really played a lot of Ubisoft games for me to have any information or even a strong opinion on it. But I guess I am looking forward to maybe in between DLC 1 and 2 because we know the first DLC is gonna come out this year. It is the second one that is I think slated for spring 2025. So perhaps maybe they move it up to like the start of 2025 or something, just so that way they can package it a little earlier. Be like, this is like a December sale where you'll get access with a code to the game and all the DLC. Um, yeah, I mean the problem with like this game versus, like, other Ubisoft games is that I don't think they've really pushed Ubisoft Plus to this extent before. I think this is, like, one of the first few games to really be like, you can just not truly own your game, but you can just rent your game now, and we'll keep the save files, but you can take your breaks, come back when you wanna use the service. Uh, but the problem is, like, if you get let's say you get the gold or standard edition of the game, and then you wanna buy the DLC later, you won't be able to use your save file because the base level of the Ubisoft Plus version, which is the one I'm running too, that is the Ultimate Edition. So I'm not really sure how sales and everything will function. I hope for the best. I don't know. I'm not really optimistic in that sense. But I think if you haven't, you know, been playing this game, I think for sure the Christmas period, the holiday season period, you'll get this game full DLC and everything, right? Like fully packaged away. I don't expect to see spring 2025 mean like March or April. I really do think it's going to be something that's going to be pushed a little earlier just because this is a game that needs to be legged out a little bit, and I can very easily see this be a case where they have the 2 official story DLCs that have the new locations story. I mean, Lando is a huge selling point, and Hondo is definitely a big selling point for a second one too. Um, but I think once you have that Lando and then you go to a Hondo, it's just a simple fact people don't know unless you've been to Galaxy's Edge. And once that happens, what's your reason to play? I can see them maybe do like a Fallen Order-esque DLC where they maybe add in like an extra few locations on the maps, maybe add something new to Kijimi that you can explore without necessarily having any real new main quest stuff. But hey, I don't know, maybe they can patch together like an almost like a Return of the Jedi tie-in where it's like, oh, now the galaxy is free. So how do all these scoundrels and bounty hunters function in like the immediate aftermath. But I don't know if there's enough story for KVS, especially with how her story ends, to really slot into like that sort of equation quite yet. And I think you'd probably want to go with bigger power players instead of KVS for that perspective, even amongst the underworld.
OVR also asks, what do we think? No, wait, I skipped one of yours. Sorry. I just got some OT and prequel dictionaries for $4, four for $4. So a dollar each, or were they $4 each? Which do you guys have if you have any dictionaries? I have still all of my childhood visual dictionaries. So the original trilogy one, and then the one for each of the one of the prequels. And then I did buy the Force Awakens one when that came out, but I never bought the ones for Rogue One, Solo, Rise of Skywalker, Last Jedi. So those are the only ones I have. I have a bunch of other source books, but those are the only visual dictionaries I have.
Yeah, I never had any of the visual dictionaries. They used to just be like the stuff when I was like in elementary school that I would read, check out from the library. Not even like check it out, but like just bring it out while we had library hour and like just read that while I check out my actual Star Wars books. But yeah, I mean, even when I was young, I always knew that like they just were going to be always overwritten, right? Like, and especially the ones that are the visual guides, they're just like they add wonderful things that writers and creatives definitely pull from. But it's not the same way as like the new essential guide to warfare, new essential guide to like the history of Star Wars and all that, right? Those books were like more lore driven that they could introduce entire new factions and kind of fill in the gaps of the stories. The dictionaries, not so much. They were just there to be like, okay, cool cross sections, just some names of things that you might have liked seeing, just some basic like surface of a lore edition. So even as a kid, I never felt like it was something I cared too much about because, well, I can always check it on Wikipedia, and there's someone there even back in like 2005 who's gonna have something even more detailed and rich about it.
Javier also says, "What do you guys think of the Star Wars Duel of the Fates script? Never heard your thoughts." Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, that was the original script for Colin Trevorrow's Episode 9 before it ultimately went through rewrites and got canceled and then restarted by Chris Terrio and J.J. Abrams for Rise of Skywalker. So my thoughts are that I like a lot of the ideas in it, especially for some of the more ancillary characters of the big three, which really should have gotten more love. Like I like a lot of the Finn stuff, and Finn gets sidelined again in Rise of Skywalker. He he probably has a smaller role in Rise of Skywalker than The Last Jedi, although I kind of like his role a little better in Rise of Skywalker than I do in The Last Jedi. So I did enjoy a lot of the Finn stuff with the Stormtrooper Trooper Rebellion, and I liked bringing in a lot of Star Warsy elements from across the saga, like Coruscant, and having a fight on Coruscant sounded cool. There are a lot of cool elements, and the idea of bringing Mortis in, I think, is a cool one. But in some ways, it's also just as much of a reach as bringing back Palpatine when you're trying to explain a very trippy Clone Wars concept to people that after 8 movies that it has nothing to do with. I think if they were going to do Mortis, probably should have started the whole trilogy with it and had some type of connection in The Force Awakens. I do like that Kylo stays evil. That was a decision I wish they kind of doubled down on. I don't think they do it awfully in Rise of Skywalker, and I don't think it would have been the worst move in the world to have him turn, but they should have sprinkled it a bit through because in both the first and second movie, he's doubling down on being evil. And then he kind of completely flips in the Rise of Skywalker. So I prefer that decision. And there were a bunch of cool Easter eggs related to Mustafar and a lot of different stuff that I think were neat about Duel of the Fates. I can't say reading a script or even reading, the comic that somebody adapted from the script that it would be better than a movie or as a movie than The Rise of Skywalker because things change. It doesn't necessarily create the same product from script to screen. Things always change. But I would say there are a lot more, I think, ideas that cohesively go with the rest of the sequel trilogy in Duel of the Fates that I prefer to Rise of Skywalker. But yeah, it was okay. I don't. There's a lot of people who say, "Oh man, this would have changed the sequels. This would have been the best movie. It would have made the sequel trilogy so great." And I don't subscribe to that ideology because you don't know how the movie would have turned out. A lot of it is on the talent, including the director, to make sure the movie turns out great. And it could have, but you never know. So we can't really play the what if game. All I'll say is that I liked a lot of the ideas in Duel of the Fates, and I think if I would have read them on the page versus some of the ideas I would have read on the page of Rise of Skywalker, I probably would have preferred some of the ideas in Duel of the Fates. But there are some that just kind of wild, like Rey and Poe together that never really worked. There are a bunch of things that I feel like don't really work in Duel of the Fates as well.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Duel of the Fates. I think even if I am disappointed more recently with Rise of Skywalker from our May watch when we did the May the 4th marathon, uh, I just did not like a lot of the choices. I think I slightly disagree about the Kylo thing. And I know that there was that interview that kind of went viral recently about how originally that was how it was pitched to uh, Adam Driver, right? And Adam Driver was like, that's what it was, and then it changed. Um, and he's a pretty monotonous guy. He doesn't really add emotions into his interviews unless like he's kind of going for a joke. But again, it's the internet. Everything gets spun, and everyone's going to be one end or the other instead of having nuance, right? Like these things happen even in massive franchises, right? Like you look at the MCU, as much as we want to say like, oh, everything from phase 1 to 3 was planned, it wasn't. It really was just phase 3 that had like a strong structure and plan in place. It was kind of Ultron that was kind of set up a lot of stuff leading to phase 3, and people did not like Ultron because it felt very Iron Man 2 in the same way where it's like, okay, they're setting up and building out the world that's necessary for future payoff. It obviously becomes a better film because it does get paid off. And that's the difference between what we have here in The Rise of Skywalker. It is introducing so many new things that you're like, okay, sure. But Duel of the Fates, I don't see in any way Duel of the Fates choices for keeping him dark really working for me. If you've read it, you know that he kind of gets almost like this built-in mask on his face because like metal just like fuses onto him, and then he just continues to make it more and more about like how he becomes completely dehuman. And I think that kind of takes away from the whole point of the Last Jedi, that even though he is this kind of monster, like there are these things about his humanity that keep on fighting against him, that his connection with Rey it makes unavoidable for him. So while I do agree that he does double down on his darkness in the first film, and it's kind of the whole point of his choices there, I do think the second one leaves him just like broken. Like I don't, he's stuck here now, but what does that mean? And the third film, Rise of Skywalker, should have actually spent more time handling that, but you have a Fortnite introduction to Palpatine and his whole story arc, right? And then you're like, okay, well, he's been every voice inside your head. And conceptually, I like all that stuff more than the execution of it, right? If again, I've been hammering this on every live we talk about the sequels. 20 to 30 minutes more to this film in a year that we had a 3 hour MCU and Avengers film. Why couldn't we get for an episode 9 closer to 3 hours? Because then some of the ideas that they do go for here would have worked. We would have had time for stuff like I had the Webbish Bog, which would have only doubled down on how much the sequels actually enjoyed getting into these weirder and stranger, fantastical elements of the Force. But the choices that Trevor R makes with those kind of same things, I do not like. I just don't like how he made Kylo Ren into this like not even like just a purely bad guy, but like there's nothing fun about him too. Like I feel like there's something fun about Kylo Ren when you watch the first two films. Like he's always intriguing. I never found anything intriguing from the script that was leaked that I'm pretty sure Trevor all basically leaked himself. And then the comic version, which we read and kind of reviewed on the channel, it just wasn't good to me. And I know I also don't like that like there's a new hidden Sith that was there from the start, and even if you don't like Palpatine coming back, it makes so much more sense than this strange Sith that's not even Plagueis, right? It's just some strange alien with something that's based off of concept art. So I don't think that was something, because it is a first draft, that was ever gonna stay that way. But I just don't like the concept of like throwing in a random Sith when you've already got the unexplained questions of Snoke to really deal with still. And I'm hoping expanded media really goes into it. And then if you're throwing this in, I don't like that. I will say though that I do laud Trevor for embracing the prequels, especially when the prequel wave of like love and support really was kicking in around 2017, 2018, because you get to see Coruscant. That is where the Stormtrooper Rebellion happens, and that's really awesome. That you get to see this planet with like the Eclipse version of the Superstar Destroyer that they have, which again, we never got a proper Superstar Destroyer. We got the Supremacy, which I think is close enough. But it was nice to see like the image of that parked over Coruscant. I thought that, while a little cheesy with a little bit of reworking, could have been something really strong, like literally being under the shadow of the Empire in this place where the sky is not the limit anymore. It is endless, right? Because that is what Coruscant is, full of skyscrapers that are just pushing all the way up through past the tallest mountain on the planet. I thought symbolically that was actually a strong choice. So I don't like that Abrams and his hesitancy, which is the nicest way of putting it, towards anything prequels. It resulted in that kind of being cut out as a location, especially since we should have seen what the Galactic Core was like reacting to with all these skirmishes and devastations and a lot of the New Republic stuff and political stuff that, again, JJ filmed and cut out. But yeah, I mean, other than Finn, I don't think anything works. I don't like Ray's story. Ray Solana is just it's the terrible name. Just a combination of Solo and Organa was just so bad to me. Um, I also don't like that there's that Ray Poe romance. That of all things to go for, like I know people love the Poe Finn shipping. I would have gone for that, right? If you want to do Finn and Ray, sure, go for that. I think that's both of those are sourced from that first film, but this Poe and Ray relationship just never made sense to me. It was like they're trying to force the Empire Strikes Back, A New Hope dynamic that is like you obviously growing, especially in Empire Strikes Back, between Leia and Han. Right there, it would have been horrible romantically to just put that in there. Yeah, I don't like a lot of the script. I love the visuals that it would have had. I really do like that, and I do like that Finn really gets his due, and I find it pretty confusing that John Boyega was, like, so thankful that JJ was back, because clearly things definitely changed from even JJ's first draft to what was in that final version, because yeah, there's just not that much about Finn, and you kinda get that pseudo Stormtrooper rebellion with Janna, but not like a true proper one like you see in Duel of the Fates, so I really do wonder, uh, like, even though he's saying, like, "I'll only come back to Star Wars if JJ is involved in some way," if, if he's giving a little bit too much credit to JJ, because even JJ didn't serve as him at all in The Rise of Skywalker, so yeah, that's how I'd put it. I like Coruscant, I like everything to do with Finn. Everything else, and I don't like. And I even the script version that we have seen in the comic, it doesn't use Leia that well either. I feel like even if you don't have a lot in Rise of Skywalker, something was decently constructed out of that, and the choice of the turn was fine. I didn't really see much of the purpose here for Leia, even in Trevorrow's script, which, from all reports, was already an issue even before Carrie Fisher was passed away, unfortunately.
Over here said, "Where did I get this shirt? I got this off of Disney's website. I don't know if it's still there, but yeah, this is it's a good one. I love this shirt. Goes with our show because I say hello there every time we start." Anthony says Kira being in Outlaws is cool. Yeah, it definitely is. I think a lot of the connections that they have to the underworld are great, especially because the underworld has been mostly enhanced by comics and canon. And so connecting to the underworld via the comic books and what they're doing with Kira right now is pretty awesome. So glad they decided to pick that up. Over
Yeah,
here,
I mean, not much else I can say. I just wish that there was a little bit more direct comic connections. But that is the limitation in some ways of keeping Kay fairly naive, fairly innocent, and overall inexperienced even by the end of the game, right? It's like her story is this is almost a game that is entirely her origin story, as opposed to the origin kicking into, like, a significant life-altering step towards her prime, right? I still don't think we're even quite there until maybe the very end. I hope the DLC really takes us to that little gap that is still there, especially now having read Star Wars 50. I'm really curious if that gap, that is there with bounty hunters with Afra and the comics all being ended, it still exists. I would say, like, maybe a month or two remains between the comics and Return of the Jedi, and I wonder if that's where K West, really shines in the margins there.
lots of shout outs for your mustache, Sonic. People are enjoying it. Anthony and over here.
Thank you,
Uh,
appreciate it.
so I think right now we've been answering questions for about 30 minutes. Let's do our review real quick of Lego Star Wars Rebuild the Galaxy, and then we'll get back to the last set of questions here before we log off for the night. Make sure you keep sending in those questions, and if you want to make sure you get one on the channel, send in a super chat. It helps us out greatly. All right, let's start with Lego Star Wars Rebuild the Galaxy, because this was a fun little release. Definitely got hyped up more than I think most Lego stuff would with Star Wars because of that initial reveal trailer when you see Jedi Bob and you see Darth Jar Jar, which was the big one. A lot of really fun things about this little mini mini movie that's broken up into 4 episodes. There are teases for more, and I think that's why they decided to make it a show and not just one long movie. But ultimately, it's pretty interesting story about the fabric of the Star Wars universe coming apart and being rebuilt in a way only Lego can, parodying the entirety of Star Wars along the way, including the prequels and the sequels and the original trilogy. There's nothing really held back, and I think that's one of the fun parts of the show. But Sonic, what did you think when you watched Star Wars or Lego Star Wars Rebuild the Galaxy, and what would you rate it out of 5?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. I think the last one that I really enjoyed for sure, and that had, like, a strong foundation for its story and its themes and message and just overall excitement, was the holiday special, the Christmas special that they did back in 2020. which because you got a little bit of a post episode 9 glimpse, right? And they did poke fun at the film and poke fun at the characters while also being like, here's like a pseudo like possibility of how Finn gets trained to be a Jedi by Rey, even though obviously you're jumping around with temple force shenanigans to different eras and all that. But this was fun, Caden Matarazzo, if you don't know his name, that's Dustin from Stranger Things. He plays Sig, who is our kind of like historian of this entire thing, or he's a guy who actually has the Force, but he's like the one guy who doesn't want to use it. He's like, I like being ordinary. I don't want to do anything. I like just telling the stories of people who have just done it, right? And, this is a fun four-parter, but I think this has a surprisingly mature arc to it that doesn't really come into full force until maybe the 3rd episode when you start seeing a little bit more of, like, Jedi Bob and what he's kinda hiding and holding back. Um but, like, I did really like it, it's fun just seeing the Force and the sect of Jedi Force builders versus the Sith destroyers. It's like that's, like, the perfect blend of people who play Legos, what type of Lego person are you versus, what type of Jedi or Force user you are. It's a nice little fun way of playing with that lore there, and then just the Lego lore that has existed on the internet and everywhere. I also like that one scene where you get to kinda see Jedi Bob's origin too, and it's very reminiscent of, like, 90s Legos and everything pre, like, you know, uh, the Lego faces and figurines matching the skin tone and color, right? This is a character who is infamous because he was just a prepackaged Jedi in, like, all these, like, episode 1 late 90s, Lego kits, and he became infamous, right? And he starts being referred as Jedi Bob, and Jedi Bob gets to shine here, and Bobby Moynihan, I think he really had a lot of fun here. I he was really good. He always hit the right punctuation with his humor. I was very impressed by that. Um, Tony Revolori, like, he gets if you don't know him, you probably know him as, like, Flash Thompson from Spider-Man MCU films, and then Zero from Grand Budapest Hotel, right? Um he plays a little bit more of a difficult role because the whole concept, like we said, is like the galaxy's rebuilt, right? And a lot of these characters that you meet at the start, they change pretty dramatically, and the changed version is the ones that you follow. That's the ones you kinda get attached to and all that. And, I think he had a bit of a difficult task kind of playing like a very, like, evil character after just being like a normal dude at the start. I don't know if I necessarily bought his, turn and everything else, but it was pretty interesting because of how it, like, tied into the themes of, like, once your life changes, right? Like, you kind of have to learn to accept it, like embrace that. That is what it is. You can't make things go back to the way they were. Not entirely, not quite, right? And the Lego concept of like being able to build anything, and if you have the right guides making it, like I liked how they used the literal Lego building to kind of go into that idea pretty well. So it's a pretty mature theme to address here, and I don't think any of the other like post Disney acquisition Lego Star Wars shorts and films I've really kind of got into. But this is one that, like, even if it doesn't get followed up, I think ends on a pretty strong note about like, yeah, no, now that this Sig character gets to, accept his fate and then make the best of it. And I think that's a pretty strong message for kids. And I don't know if it's a little like dark in some ways, maybe a little dark for if you're like just a joyful kid expecting things to all go perfectly right. But this is definitely one that has a lot more historical connection through Jedi Bob. Likes to poke fun at Star Wars history constantly, and in so many ways is poking fun at the fandom behind that too. So I think this is one that I think a lot of the older audiences will appreciate for sure. But still great fun with seeing stuff like the inversions, like a Darth Falcon, Luke Skywalker pod racing, but not necessarily being a good guy. Darth Jar Jar, like you said. I really like Darth Nubs. Nubs just being introduced in the young Republic Adventures, or that little preschool show, right? And then kind of become like a supporting Sith character here. It's pretty hilarious. But yeah, no, I'm excited for the future if there is one. I like some of the teases there. And this definitely lets the Lego Star Wars, like, films and movies and TV shows kind of continue doing these one-offs, like, if they really want to, but then go into, like, their own full-fledged universe where they can just blend what they like about and satirize what they want to, like always, but then blend it into another story that is entirely unique to their own universe that they're building out here, which I think that's pretty fun. I like that LEGO is taking almost, like, control and charge of, the Star Wars mandates and story that they have to usually build around. This one is just them being like, "No, I think we'll see what you offer, and then from there, we'll make what we want, and we'll enjoy ourselves because that's the fun about Lego. You can be super creative with it."
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a story that is ultimately still aimed at a younger audience. This is very much so out of all the Star Wars stuff that Lego has made recently with its specials. This is the one that's most indicative of the creative spirit behind something like the Lego movie, where it is aimed at children. It has a very straightforward plot, but with the Easter eggs, with the references, with the jokes that can sometimes be a little bit higher level or more aimed at adults. It's a lot of fun to check out. And the fact that it's really short too makes it certainly worth watching. I enjoyed all the little Easter eggs in this film. There's so many. I think they especially chose a lot of fun characters to be the new Jedi Council and the new kind of Sith army slash inquisitorius that's full of characters that you wouldn't expect to be Sith lords, as well as the Jedi one too. I thought was particularly pretty fun. So I liked all that. There's a great little tag at the end that's very funny, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they do in the future with that. But so many different things. There's a lot of creativity put in here. It's not just things being kind of thrown at the wall or little gags. There's a lot of creativity in this little mini series. So I enjoyed quite a bit of this, and I did think the main characters usually in something like this, right, when you're looking for the inversions and the different changes and how creative they can be with the changes and getting engrossed in that type of world, you would think that the main characters would kind of just be vehicles to go through the story, but there
Right,
actually is a decent little bit of depth there. They do make a stamp. They are, the best parts of this, despite all the other fun references around it. Um, I would say though, the Darth Jar Jar thing I think lives up to the hype, but I wanted more. There's not that much Darth Jar Jar, and that was ultimately a little disappointing. Other than that, I had a lot of fun watching Lego Star Wars Rebuild the Galaxy. So you guys should definitely check it out. And if I was going to give it a score out of 5, this one's kind of tough because man, it's completely different than a normal type of show. An argument could be made this is like half a season of a show if they are going to make more in this. But as it stands now, I'd give it like a 3.25 or 3.5, somewhere in there. I think it's certainly worth checking out. It's certainly a fun little piece of Star Wars. And if you guys are interested in the Lego style humor, I think you will enjoy it.
yeah, I agree. I would also give it a 3.5 just because of the surprising depth said with that main character and the themes that the final episode really, really, like, sinks into and just goes fully into it, right? I think if you look at the initial episodes, it is that fun inversions that you're caring about, but then by the end, you're like, "Oh, I'm surprisingly, like, affected by the choices that have been made and the consequences of this story." So, yeah, I'm looking forward to still the silliness of this, but even if they don't continue it, I think this is, like, one of the most understated Lego Star Wars stories out there.
Well, getting back to the chat here now for the last 15, 20 minutes of our stream. Again, if you want to make sure you get a chat on, make sure you send in a super chat. That is going to bump your chat to the top, and we always appreciate the support. But to continue here with Anthony, who says, "For me, my version of the sequel trilogy would include pretty much all of the characters seen in the sequel trilogy, but some of the character decisions would be changed. I would tease Palpatine's return at the end of the first movie, then go full Dark Empire. You have, yeah. I think if you're rewriting any version of the sequel trilogy, you have to put Palpatine references into the first movie. It's the only way to make that really work and connect. Anthony also says I would even have Matt Smith play younger Palpatine in both flashbacks and clone body version, right? And Ben versus Matt Smith Palpatine would be awesome. Yeah. So are there any other parts of your story here that I'm missing before we comment on it? Nope, it doesn't look like it. Starts going into conversation about Dark Empire. So, yeah, as for your points, I think that would be a way to improve the sequel trilogy. I think in general, I probably would have gone for something different than Dark Empire. Dark Empire, while I appreciate it, it's a fun story. I love that it reunited Star Wars comics. And I actually really love the art style. It's grown on me so much over the years. But ultimately, it is a story that takes place very close to Return of the Jedi. I think that's where it works a little better. When you have Luke and when you have Leia and you have Han, they can still finish the job of this evil menace that is Palpatine. I think it Palpatine being defeated and then we can move on to other conflicts is something that works much better earlier in the timeline if they did it. I'm cool with it never having been done, but since it happened, I would have preferred it far earlier, like closer to Return of the Jedi, maybe 5 years at most after Return of the Jedi. So I wouldn't have done that. I would basically, if it was me, change the entirety of the overarching narrative of the sequel trilogy. But I think the bones of the characters that are there are all good, and I think the relative structure of the idea around something like a First Order is interesting. But I think I would have personally gone for something completely different. But we say that in hindsight, back in again, say this every time, back in 2015, the prequel hate was still so strong. People just wanted something reminiscent of the original trilogy, and that's what they gave us with The Force Awakens. So it's not really, if you look back at the time where we were in 2012, 13, 14, when this movie was getting off the ground, it was a no-brainer to go this direction, at least for the first movie. But yeah, that's an interesting idea though, because I do think one of the number one things that would have helped the sequel trilogy connectivity obviously would be to sprinkle Palpatine in throughout the three movies, even if you don't reveal him until the last one.
Yeah, I mean, I know people want to say stuff like, "Oh, Knights of Ren should have had a bigger role" and all that. Um, I don't know. I don't really care too much about the Knights of Ren. I think they should have had a role in The Last Jedi, but I was kind of fine with how they're used in Episode 9. They're just kind of like a posse, an entourage more than anything to me. It was really just that flashback in that Force vision in The Force Awakens that had any promise. That being said, I do really like how Charles Soule uses him, and that group in both his Rise of Kylo Ren comic, as well as, their appearances during Crimson Reign and everything. So, it's pretty interesting as a group, but they're not meant to really be, like, these ultimate baddies or anything. They're just kind of like cool looking designs. And that's a problem with the sequels is that they have a little bit of that Boba Fett issue, but it's like that group and Phasma. So that's like a lot of notable characters at that point. Um, but I still think you can keep them the same way. I think, like I've been saying, especially more recently, it is just disappointing that all of the scenes with the New Republic politics, which is necessary to differentiate us from the original trilogy and differentiate us from the period of the politics that we got in the prequel trilogy. It was shot and it's not there, right? Like, yeah, okay, you see that one person staring out at the Starkiller base's beams hitting the planet, right? And then, oh, everyone's kinda scared and about to die, but it's annoying because she had scenes with Leia that were shot that really showcase the resistance is not the rebellion. It's a smaller faction of people who are prepared for a threat like this to emerge because the government's in gridlock. It's all explained there, and it's wonderful in Bloodline. That is probably the most underrated, if not top 5, canon novel for Star Wars. It's probably the best Leia novel ever. Like, just so good, and it's built off of that, right? And it's built off of a scene like that. But yeah, it's not there, and it's frustrating, right? It's like you have the core cell scenes, and then you don't put them in, and I don't think you necessarily need even more than that. I think you should have the resistance feel like they are trying to go back to the good old rebellion days and make it all work out. And then that's when the Last Jedi and the complexity of the situation of like, oh, well, this time they're not coming out to support us, right? What's going on? Like, even though we still have some of the stalwarts, right? That would have worked. And like I said before, the Last Jedi, I think structurally still is fine. It's just it doesn't make sense 5 minutes after the consequences of the Force Awakens. It makes sense more like 6 months to a year after, where you could still then justify why Finn is feeling the pressure to like go save Ray and instead of being dedicated to this cause. Maybe he's been doing things he just feels like, oh my god, I'm stuck into another machine now, in another war. You can still understand some of the things with Poe if it's like an entrenched warfare that's going on, these hit and runs, and he's finally gone for a big swing here, and then obviously, Leia doesn't like it because she's seen multiple years of war, but he hasn't necessarily, right? I still like a lot of what Luke has going on for him. I know that would probably be difficult to work with a year gap, but I'm sure there's ways to write still that same characterization and then still give us some nice tidbits of lore. Um, I know people were talking and that there were rumors that um, Scaling Michael, I think that's Scaling Michael, that I think the island that they shot at, there were rumors that the Knights of Ren came on to set and they were fighting Ray and Luke. That was
Mhm.
such a huge, huge leak at one point, and we've never really heard anything since about that. But I think that's probably one thing I would have added, just so you could have like a Luke moment, even if he's not using the Force, you could still have him be like, "Ah, I'm still this. I still know how to twirl a lightsaber better than you, like ruffians," and then help out. What is it? Uh, yeah, help out Ray and still have his disagreements about like the Jedi returning and all that, just being like, look, see, this is what it's gonna happen. Now everyone's emboldened to keep coming for us. I still think you could tie it to his messages and all that. Especially if it was to that deleted scene of that third and final lesson, if you kind of tied it into that. But yeah, uh, I still like what is there with Snoke. I wish there was something more concrete about how he came into power, especially knowing that Ray Sloan kind of kicks off the First Order, and then she's at some point usurped by this guy. And all we know about him so far is that he does recruit Kylo at some point, that he did possibly fight Luke at some point, and that he helped a lot of escaping Imperials navigate the unknown regions. And that's why he started getting a little bit infamy and eventually got pulled into this power structure. But yeah, I think the only thing I would kind of change is that you see him almost feel like his mind is disconnected or something in that moment where he doesn't realize what's going on. Like I don't think you undo what Kylo Ren is thinking about like his true enemy, and you can still have that little tiny speech, right? But I almost want to feel like something was like blocking him, like he feels like something is affecting him in the Force, and he can still kind of go into that Force Awakens tangent of like, do you feel it, that strange thing going on with the Force Awakening? If something is now interfering with him, bam, then you have like, oh, there's something lurking in the shadows. Okay, there's your Palpatine. And I'm trying to say all this without like changing the story too much. I'm really trying to keep it as close as possible. Uh, but for sure, The Rise of Skywalker, I want to see Aya Webbish Bog because I think that's a great way narratively of kind of just forcing the story upon us and the choices kind of almost being predetermined, but it is how you execute it that's most important. And of course, why is it in Fortnite, man? Why is it in Fortnite? Just have Palpatine's speech be broadcast, have him awaken, teased at the last end of the Last Jedi with like a little laugh, and then you get to see the speech kick us off, and then you can maybe see glimpses of that difficult year of like everyone trying to chase after him. And then this is like the plot of, oh, we finally figured out these are like the last two steps to finally get to him, and we've been vying back and forth, right? And then you can tie in all the Batu stuff and all that, part of that chase to Palpatine. But yeah, it has its issues as a trilogy. I do genuinely think that all it really needs is a Clone Wars equivalent and a lot more extended material, just like how the prequels were getting so much during the release of each film. and we'll look at it a bit more fondly. Even if we don't truly ever love it, like as older fans, I think a lot of younger fans, if they got some of this extended material and got their own version of the Clone Wars for this, would absolutely love it the same way the prequel fans can ignore so many flaws of the trilogy as a whole.
Skywalker's Academy used the his member chat, so we appreciate you for being a member, Skywalker's Academy, and always supporting the channel through that. Skywalker's Academy says, I say use Ian McDiarmid while we still have him. Young Palpatine can return in the Rey movie, and then he can return and should, in his opinion. That is certainly a bold take I've never heard before, Skywalker's Academy. And then you said, young Palpatine uses a force trick or projection to appear as a force ghost as a young Jedi to Rey and guides her to find Sith artifacts. If you're asking me, he impersonates one of them. He's just claiming to be important to know that all he needed to do was destroy all he needed to be destroyed to rid the galaxy of the possibility of Sith's return. That is a really interesting take. I can't say I agree with you as much as I appreciate your idea. I love Ian McDiarmid. You guys know how much I love Ian McDiarmid. Palpatine's my favorite Star Wars villain, but we don't need any more Palpatine post Return of the Jedi, um, and especially post Rise of Skywalker. I don't mind them getting into the specifics around Exegol if we want to bring back Palpatine for some of those. I don't think we need anything some completely locked in with Palpatine as the main villain. I don't mind seeing him in the shadows or appearing in, the finale of whatever this Mandalorian Thrawn story is, and you see the Shadow Council, and then you kind of see somebody run up, and maybe it's General Pride or somebody connected to Palpatine. You see something related to Palpatine, and you see Ian McDiarmid there, and I've appreciated his appearances throughout in different small moments in some of these shows. But I think I'm done with Palpatine. But I understand kind of the idea for continuing to push into the Palpatine legacy, and I think that could help the reclamation of the like Rey Skywalker thing. Like if you push into Rey in that movie, she has to still kind of be fighting with who she is, the pull to the dark, the pull from the light, the way she runs her academy. All those different things I think should be part of the character because they've now decided, to make her Palpatine's daughter basically. She has to still kind of be grappling with what that means, right? That type of legacy, the same way Luke and Leia did when you found out they were the children of Darth Vader. So I think we should have Palpatine's fingerprints on the Rey movie, but I don't think we should have more Palpatine as a character. And then you just commented, not Ian McDiarmid as Palpatine after Rise of Skywalker, let the guy retire. I'm talking about the younger version. Some people still want to see, then do a prequel with the young Pal. Okay, yeah. Then I was very confused because you said Rey movie. Um, so I was confused that what you were saying. But if you're saying, yeah, more Ian McDiarmid in the 30-year gap that's building up to Rise of Skywalker, then I'm for that. I just don't want to see don't want to see any more Palpatine post post Rise of Skywalker. I think we should move on to some other villains and some other concepts for Star Wars here.
Yeah, I have a lot of the same thinking. I know Matt Smith was supposed to be some like acolyte or something that is then used as a vessel in the fight. But I would have liked to seen. But I can also understand how emotionally that might have been a little harder for us to connect with if it's a random dude, and he probably would have taken up a lot of runtime to be developed, which again, they didn't afford that 3 hours, and even if they did, I don't know how much you can really work him. Like, yes, villains don't necessarily need a lot of time. Like, Vader only has, like, what, 10 minutes in the first film? So, yeah, sure, but, like, there are things about Vader's appearances and the voice and everything that really makes his every scene work. As much as Matt Smith is a great actor, I don't think his looks alone, his stature and everything, and the role that he'd kinda have to play before then being used as a vessel would be entertaining enough to follow and not follow the Kylo Ren story and all that. Unless, like, he is tied into and, maybe trying to work against what Kylo Ren is doing and what his master has for planned for Kylo Ren as opposed for the acolytes, right? If it was almost like a insurrection that ultimately fails, and then he's used as this puppet, right? Maybe that would be nice, I guess. Um, but that's like something I would maybe want to see more of, like happen in an animated show that's set in between 8 and 9, and more the infighting of the First Order versus Final Order and the remnants post, right? Like you said, Star Wars Academy, I'd want to see that 30 years with that, like this almost House of Palpatine story kind of fleshed out. Dathan, you don't really need too much more of him. I think what we see in Shadow of the Sith is more than enough for him, but you could still see other clones. And if you want to have like a younger clone that doesn't have any force powers, like Dathan, that is like reckoning with the legacy, or instead of being a strand cast, but it's like maybe somehow a stable clone just doesn't have the force either, and is then like setting out to destroy these Sith artifacts, has all the knowledge of his memories and everything, and is like, yeah, I mean, I don't know why it didn't happen for me, but I can't use the force. But maybe I can give you some information about the psychology of this character and all that. I could see that, but I would still prefer Ian to be kind of doing it, and we're not really going to get a younger Ian at this age, especially de-age, deep faked, or whatever, to really pull off something that nuanced and complex. So yeah, just everything up to the Rise of Skywalker, but nothing after for me. I think maybe at best you can do is like a Hand of Thrawn situation where you are dealing with like the legacy of him, the visage of Palpatine, and maybe the effects on the Final Order, the First Order, and then the galaxy after this many decades.
And Dathan would not be dead in the Mando movie because he dies in around 20 BBY, which is when the book takes place for Skywalker, or I mean, what is it called?
Shadow
Shadow of
Sith.
the Sith. Yeah, the book takes place around 20 BBY or ABY, so he wouldn't be dead yet. He would be relatively young. So yeah, you could. I mean, you could do that. There's, like I said, I love Palpatine. I want to see the Plagueis movie or series, whatever they decide to do that. I want a young Palpatine, but I don't know if I could convince myself that I want to see more Palpatine post Rise of Skywalker, even if it is Dark Empire style, young clone Palpatine or young spirit Palpatine. But, you know, just because I wouldn't be excited to see it doesn't mean they couldn't make it awesome. Like you would just have to see the project. I would go in a different direction with some new stories and try something different. I think especially with Ray, you need to kind of carve out. She's so tied to all the nostalgia that the sequels have with the original trilogy. You kind of need to carve out her own identity for her and then move her beyond what makes her different from Luke and Anakin, and how do we give her her own distinct version of her story and her Jedi. That's something I would much prefer to see instead of bringing it back to the same villain. But appreciate the thought. Thanks for sharing that. Scrolling back to the top, we'll go for a few more minutes here, maybe for 8 minutes until an hour, 40 minutes. We've already gone over the hour and a half. But we still have so many questions we didn't get to this week. But that was just the nature. We were reviewing some things this week, but hopefully we're able to get to everything next week for you all. So I'm trying to remember where we left off. I think it was Ovier saying that they haven't read Dark Empire yet, but need to finish Last Command. Yeah, so a little conversation there between Ovier and Anthony. And then where's the next question we've got here? It looks like Anthony. One thing that I've been wondering is, do you guys think there are any Jedi in the Skywalker line before Anakin? Some people on Reddit think Revan or Zane Carrick are distant ancestors of Anakin. That's an interesting thought too. We never really think of the Skywalker bloodline prior to Shmi because Anakin was created by the Force, but could there have been other people before Shmi that were still part of the Skywalkers that did have Jedi ancestry that kind of allowed the midichlorians within Shmi to be able to create with the Force this chosen one being? That's an interesting thought. I've never really thought about it. I wouldn't really want it to be somebody like Revan. I wouldn't want, them. I like the idea of having other very important people before the chosen one. They're all building blocks to the chosen one, right? Like they think that's important. Narrowing the grasp of Star Wars. And yes, I've been arguing for the fact that we need to refocus on the original characters to bring back that spirit and excitement and quality to Star Wars. But to me, somebody like Revan is important and big enough to where you don't really need the rest of the Skywalkers. You don't need to tie him into Skywalkers to make him bigger. Um, that being said, I don't know how I feel about that. I would have to think about that. I'm not completely opposed to having another Jedi in the Old Republic or, 1,000 generations before Shmi. And that just, those midichlorians, that gene just slowly faded away. But yeah, I've never thought about that specific question. That's a good question.
I think it works if you go with the consideration of it almost being that Star Wars is like a LOTOR, like Lord of the Rings, where the first age, the second age, third age, like we see the books that is the main story in the third age, but all the history and everything before indicates that it's a world that was richer, stronger, more powerful. The magic was all there, right? And in that sense, then you could be like, okay, sure. Then we have Anakin's ancestors of Zane and Revan, who even if they're super super far distant, and all that, have this power that is just so undeniable that no matter what, some part of them through all the different variations and trees reaches into Anakin, and that almost like fuels him in his own way in his bloodline. But I do like just the Force being a reaction to Plagueis and his experiments and being like, "No way, buddy, we're not going to let you do that." And then someone like a Palpatine, where that's where his genius lies, is that instead of just being simply fascinated by Anakin, he's like, "Oh, I've stumbled upon this guy. Now let me manipulate him and shape and craft him while I let everyone else kind of do the dirty work and deal with the consequences and smoothing it out that's necessary as I start shaping these galactic events that are his staging grounds, his training grounds." So yes, yes to that question. If you're saying and looking at the like old Republic and all that era as like just genuinely more powerful and richer and stronger on average. Um, but I don't know if I personally see that being how Star Wars is constructed. Like, no matter what, even if you love Revan, even if you love all these characters of the Old Republic, I don't think anyone is saying, other than maybe Darth Vishit, that they're stronger than Anakin and Luke and Leia and Palpatine and all that. It's a little uncommon to say that. And I think one thing with how the Force works is that the less Jedi there are, the Jedi that do come about end up being very powerful, right? So even if you don't like that Rey is powerful, right? I think the concepts of the Strandcast and father and the connections to Palpatine by blood and all that machinations there, and then just the Force rising up with there only being like her and Ben Solo and maybe like 5 to 10 other notable Jedi until they're killed off or whatever, makes sense, right? But if we're talking about Zayn and Revan in this era where they're like just one of many, I really doubt that they're so special and powerful enough that they're even more stronger than the characters that we follow in the films. Because let's face it, as much as people love the Old Republic, it still is fairly unknown compared to someone who's seen the Skywalker saga or seen the Mandiverse or something like that.
I think one of the only things that would hold me back from having a Skywalker in the Old Republic would be just that I think the magic, what George Lucas is trying to say, the specialness of Anakin, the magic behind Anakin and the Skywalker family is that they emerge from nothing, right? They
Yeah.
emerge from a woman who has been sold into slavery and has no possibility of escape on this planet. She's in a forgotten planet, not even connected to the Republic. It's really just the will of the Force that she comes across these Jedi, and ultimately Anakin's journey begins. And so that's kind of the specialness of that story. And so that would be the main thing that would hold me back from having somebody in the Skywalker line before Anakin and Shmi. But obviously, Shmi does have parents who had parents who had parents. So there's not a there. It would not. It definitely would not be above the way franchise filmmaking and franchise world building exists in the modern Hollywood. It would not be beneath them to not name drop somebody with the name Skywalker in an Old Republic series, uh, even if they were just like, the smuggler who went and did something for one scene, or a pilot who was really good, and they're like, "Hey, what's your name?" And they're like, "Oh, my name's Skywalker." It would be they would think it was this really cool moment. I think a lot of us would roll our eyes, but hey, it doesn't mean they can't do it. I wouldn't be opposed to seeing some Skywalker who doesn't have force powers, but does contribute to the effort in the Old Republic. But hey, I think I would prefer not. I like I said, I think having these types of special people who are building blocks to ultimately getting the chosen one, I think is just as important for this universe as we move on past the Skywalkers, um, to show that not everything revolves around them. Just they were the crux of basically the ideological conflict of the galaxy of all for all these years. But we'll see. But I think that's going to have to wrap up our stream tonight. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this week's stream. Hopefully, you enjoyed hearing our thoughts on all the topics that we discussed today. We didn't get to a few of them. Maybe we'll get to them next week. Thanks for all your questions and your comments and for your support all these weeks whenever we do these streams. We always appreciate you guys showing up and really enjoy discussing Star Wars with you all. Make sure you come back next week. And if you're new, subscribe for more streams just like this. We do these every single Tuesday. We have been doing 7 p.m. Pacific time. So if you, or 7:30 p.m. Pacific time. So if you guys like that time, let us know. If you want it to be earlier or later, let us know as well. So make sure you like the video. If you haven't, subscribe to the channel for more. Join our memberships. We had plenty of members in the chat today, and we always appreciate your supports and your comments. So make sure you check out our memberships or Patreon. You can subscribe there for lots of other great perks. Thank you so much for watching this week's stream, and we will see you all next week for yet another Ask Us Anything. Good night, everybody.